Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. While I am the Director of Sustainable Development at UNDP today, I used to head UNDP's Biodiversity and Ecosystems program, and it was in that capacity that we cooked up BIOFIN. And it's wonderful to see it grow. It's wonderful to see all of you here. You've come from far and wide, and we'd like to thank the Mexican government for hosting us. We're all looking forward to coming back to Mexico later this year for the CBD COP. Now, I started my career in a Ministry of Finance. Actually, I worked for a textile industry before I went to the Ministry of Finance, and I decided I was excited about biodiversity and made the transition from finance to working for a Ministry of Environment and Conservation, later consulting, and then joining the United Nations. And currently I've come full circle in my current job as the Director of Sustainable Development, where I have a very wide remit, which includes biodiversity and environment, but it also includes, most importantly, poverty eradication, food security, economic recovery, post-crisis, jobs and livelihoods, the private sector work of UNDP, and much else. So it's a very, very broad scope. And I don't get enough time to think about biodiversity, let alone participate in meetings such as this. So this is particularly special for me. Now, last year, the global community, heads of state, approved a new agenda for global development known as Agenda 2030, with a set of aspirational development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, two of these deal directly with biodiversity. One dealing with life in the oceans, life in water, and the other life on land. Now, what is clear is that we're not going to achieve those goals, and from a CBD perspective, the Aichi targets, unless we address the threats that face biodiversity in a holistic way. And as those threats are really rooted in development, we really need to look at development more broadly in terms of finding solutions to the challenges we face. Now, the SDGs have an ambitious goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. There are still 700 million people on the planet today who live on less than $1.90 a day. Now, that's a big and tall order, but we can't do it unless we protect our natural ecosystems. One key point is that in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to need economic growth. And one of the reasons is that the world population continues to grow. Okay, the world population, by the way, was 1 billion in 1900. It is 7.4 billion today. It'll grow by another billion by 2030, okay, aligned with Agenda 2030, and is not expected to stabilize until it hits 11.2 billion. Now, globally, while population is growing, the rate of job production is falling. So we have a mismatch between the needs to provide people with decent livelihoods and income security through proper jobs and population growth. And that is a real worry. So we cannot address the needs of people without economic growth. But at the same token, we cannot continue to grow endlessly if we do not grow sustainably. We need to decouple economic growth from biodiversity destruction and, of course, climate change as well. And if we don't, we're not going to be able to sustain that economic growth. Now, we've got to put BIOFIN into that context. BIOFIN was conceived as an initiative initially to assist countries with their resource mobilization efforts to address the Aichi targets. It's evolved because we realized that the finance system as a whole plays a critical role in defining the future of biodiversity. Why? Because it provides the investments which either lead to the destruction of biodiversity or, conversely, investments that lead to its preservation. Now, globally, and think of this dynamically, I think all of us in our day-to-day jobs, we look at a problem as it exists today, but look at the world in terms of what it might look like. By the year 2050, it has been estimated, and this is a statistic I'm using because we're sitting by the beautiful Pacific Ocean, there's likely to be more plastic in the oceans than fish biomass, and total fish biomass has fallen by 11% since 1977. So we're actually going to have more plastic in the oceans than fish biomass, and the problem is that fish are consuming plastic. And it's tiny particulate plastic in the oceans, We have 5 major gyres that are ocean circulation systems just composed of plastics. And in the North Pacific, we have one, the largest, which is twice the size of Texas. This is a serious problem, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? And then we really can only address it by dealing with plastic production in the first place. Now, there are new alternatives to the kind of plastics we've been using in the past, but we need to invest in them. Now, the cost of cleaning up all this plastic is going to be enormous. I mean, the cost of going to the North Pacific gyre is just, it's prohibitive. We don't have the resources to do it. So better to deal with it at source. And this is really a key issue. From a pure biodiversity perspective, these plastics are undermining ecosystems, but they're leading globally to significant kills of mammals, some 100,000 sea mammals killed every year as a result of ingesting plastics, and also up to 1 million seabirds. I mean, it's a massive problem. So the question is, how do we use the finance system to start to change the trajectory of development, to change behavior, our behavior, your behavior, and also to provide incentives for us to live more responsibly. As I said, we can't grow endlessly unless we grow sustainably. So how do we use the finance system to do that? Now let's put in context the resources available or at play for us to bank upon here. Now, the high-level panel on biodiversity, set up under the Convention on Biodiversity, in which I was associated, estimated that we would need $110 billion to $440 billion a year in order to achieve the Aichi targets. Others, estimating the costs of addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, have said we need $5 trillion a year to do so. Elsewhere, the Global Canopy Program estimated we're currently spending $50 billion a year on biodiversity-related activities around the world. The problem is these figures are based on top-down estimations. They're good guesses. We extrapolate based on the knowledge we have now. We just actually do not have figures which are credible because they're not constructed from the bottom up. And that is a real problem, and that's one of the reasons why we designed BIOFIN, to actually work with Ministries of Finance, because this is a finance issue, and cannot be addressed by Ministries of Environment, working alone, to be able to start to track biodiversity expenditure across multiple sectors. Now, that tracking has 2 parts. There's positive spend and there's negative spend. There's things that we spend which actually lead to biodiversity loss, and there's things that we spend which lead to biodiversity gain. And at the very least, we need to understand what those are, because ignorance isn't bliss here. Ignorance leads to catastrophe. So we need to understand what they are and what the implications of our decisions are. Now, globally, Credit Suisse has estimated that there are $250 trillion at play in wealth for investment. That's really, really significant. Okay, it's much bigger because it's accumulated wealth for investment than global GDP, which is about $80 trillion a year. But it's a very, very significant amount. And the question is, how do we mobilize those resources for the broader progressive goals that we have in the Sustainable Development Agenda, for poverty eradication, and so on and so forth, and then ultimately to provide the framework, the bedrock of sustainability that we need to create the growth that we need to sustain ourselves. And that's really a key issue. Now, the World Economic Forum in 2013 published an interesting report which looked at the interconnection between the global finance system and finance risk and the environment. So the interconnections there. And I just wanted to throw out one figure which has just been touted recently, and that's what the figure, the importance of global pollinators, bats, birds, insects responsible for pollinating the food we eat. Now, 35% of the crops that we eat are at least in part, dependent on pollination by wild pollinators, such as the ones I referred to, in order to reproduce. And the cost, if we were to lose wild pollinators, has variously been estimated by the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, at some $235 billion to $577 billion. Now, if we were to lose pollinators, it will have an impact on the finance system, So we really need to start to address issues such as this. And of course, this is what the World Economic Forum, it wasn't us, it wasn't the biodiversity community raising this, it was the World Economic Forum. It was businesses sort of looking at finance risk attached to the collapse of Earth systems. Now, at BIOFIN, the team has been looking very carefully at what the solutions might be. And they've identified 4 things that we need to do, 4 relatively simple things. I mean, they get very complicated when you think them through, but they're relatively simple at a headline level. The first is to avoid future expenditures where possible. That is, spend money now to avoid future costs and existing costs. Now, a very good example of this is when we control invasive alien species. Around the world, and many of you coming from small islands, I mean, confronted with the devastating impacts of non-native species when introduced to your environment in terms of attacking native biodiversity and then having a major impact on your agriculture, your forests and fisheries and other major sectors. Now today, we have a problem in Madagascar where the Asian toad, we think this comes from Thailand, has appeared on the island associated with a mining operation. It's in a relatively contained area. We think today, and this is colleagues at the New York Natural History Museum who conveyed this to me just last week, $5 million to eradicate this toad. Now, if we fail to spend that now, the impacts in the future in terms of the loss of biodiversity and the impacts on economic activities such as honey production and others are likely to be very, very severe. Why do I say honey production? Because another species from South America, the cane toad, was deliberately introduced into Australia in 1936 in a bid to control scarab beetles which were affecting sugarcane, have now multiplied beyond all proportion and are having a calamitous economic effect and an ecological effect on Australia, and tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars are being spent every year in trying to contain that particular species. Now, another figure here which is really relevant is that we estimate some $50 trillion will be spent on infrastructure development over the next 20 years. Now, that's a very significant sum. And the question is, how are we going to build that infrastructure? Do we apply due diligence and safeguards, or do we not? And if we don't, well, the costs could be very, very high in terms of further losses of biodiversity. And then the costs of containing those losses are going to be very high too, higher than they need be had we actually taken action at the beginning to try and design that infrastructure in a way which reduces harm to biodiversity. We need to think about that because avoiding future costs is going to be key, and maybe in some cases we have irreversible impacts or the future costs are so prohibitive that we can't take action. I think that the cost of removing plastics from the ocean fit into that category. We just don't know how to do it yet. So let's keep that in mind. The second key point, the solution, is to realign expenditures. So that means basically use existing funds which are released, okay, because they're not being spent well or because they're actually having a biodiversity adverse impact in protecting biodiversity. Now, currently global subsidies for fishing are in the order of $35 billion a year, and it's one of the key causes in terms of leading to overfishing. 70% of fish stocks around the world are either fully exploited or overexploited. Now, 3 billion people around the planet depend on fish as a primary source of protein, and fish is particularly critical for poor communities living in coastal areas. I think particularly in the Philippines, you'll have seen this, and the importance of fish to diets and to nutrition. And, you know, if you actually, the collapse in fisheries, where it's happened, is having really calamitous impacts in terms of nutrition in coastal communities. So we need to basically be looking at that and saying, well, is that a good spend? How do we, you know, looking at the total cost to society, how do we reorient that expenditure? And that's something we need to do, and it's not easy, and it's politically unpalatable because the benefits are long-term and the costs are short-term. But on the other hand, I'm an optimist, and I think, you know, if we need to change behavior in order to sustain our existence, and we have to do this at some stage. We need to take a hard look at these things now. Another key point, and when I worked in the Ministry of Finance, and we were looking at environment budgets, we were saying, well, why do we want to invest in environment when the Department of Environment only delivered 30% of its budget last year? Poor delivery, poor results, question marks regarding corruption in the ministry. And of course, as the custodians of finance, colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, of course, we're very hesitant about investing in environment. If we're going to use galvanized resources for biodiversity, we need to deliver better. We need to show that the resources we are spending are achieving the results that we anticipated, and we need to work efficiently. Okay, so the mantra around the world is do more with less. We're in an age of austerity. We have serious fiscal constraints in many countries. There isn't an abracadabra solution in being able to pour more and more money into finding solutions. We do need to find a better way of working and to work more effectively. And one of the key points about BIOFIN is by tracking expenditure and then linking it to policy and linking it to institutional effectiveness, we start to understand whether or not it's a good spend or a bad spend. And sometimes you need to take institutional reform steps in order to ensure that we have the capacities to deliver and the credibility that we need in order to ensure that the Ministry of Finance has the cover it needs in protecting the wealth of a nation. And finally, we need to generate new revenue streams. Now, I talked a little bit about how much it would cost to achieve the SDGs. Globally, ODA is in the order of about 140 billion a year. Global north-south flows of philanthropy are about 48 billion a year. Total remittances, important to many countries, 640 billion a year, none of which add up to 5 trillion. Now, and certainly we wouldn't be spending all of that just on biodiversity. So we need new sources of funds, and that means we really need to mobilize domestic and international resources, public and private resources, and we're going to need to change the way we tap into resources. Now, I talked about the total stock of wealth that's out there, 250 trillion. One of the ways that we think we can generate new revenue is to sort of bank on institutional investments. Currently, the total stock of institutional investments from pension funds and insurance funds is in the order of $55 trillion. We've been working with the Danish pension fund as UNDP to see whether they will invest 1% of their 35 billion fund in green business. And for that, we're going to need to design the opportunities that provide the economic dividends we seek and protect biodiversity. And I see there's a lot of opportunity for this in the areas of a new generation of mariculture and fish culture, which avoids some of the deleterious environmental effects, disease flows from farmed fish into wild populations, and other things. There's some really interesting work going on in Australia at the moment and looking at farming of southern bluefin tuna and so on. These are really high-cost ventures, but high gain too. So how do we get private capital to be invested into these? And I think from what BIOFIN does is it sort of gives us a bottom-up perspective that helps us to see at a particular country level what the solutions might be, tailored to those particular country needs. It is aspirational. So we're looking to make big changes, I mean, not just changes at the margin, but we're looking for the win-win solutions as well. And ultimately, we're looking to ensure that our Ministries of Finance, which have got the responsibilities for managing finances in the nation, feel that this is a good use of resources. And that's really why the process is so important in BIOFIN. It's not just coming in with a consulting report and dropping it on a desk and then watching it slowly gather dust on a shelf, but actually engaging with everybody in the process and to feel that they're part of the solutions. Now, we have to change our discourse. We need a common language when we start to talk about biodiversity finance. I'm afraid that in the CBD community, and I see this particularly having sort of exited, I haven't exited, I've still got a foot in it, and I'll be here in Mexico, but we tend to sort of expect resources to come flowing in, and we don't really use the language of global finance, and we need to change that. And similarly, the finance community needs to understand the challenges, such as the ones I just laid out with waste and food security and from loss of pollination, etc., and to find solutions that are transformative. I'm pleased, of course, that at Davos each year, the World Economic Forum, these things are now on the agenda, but what we need to do is to land it at country level. Now, what we're going to do in Los Cabos this week is to talk about our respective experiences, and I think because we have a wide array of partners here, we'll be able to sort of, perhaps bridge some of these gaps, but of course we're trying to do that within country, but across countries. Now, BIOFIN has evolved, because when we first initiated it, we were just looking at resource mobilization and finance flows. I mean, ultimately, that's what the convention was concerned with. We realized early on that we had to look at policy and institutional factors because of the points I made earlier. The amount of finance you need is dependent on your policy choices, and your institutional effectiveness depends on how effectively you spend it. And we basically had a typology which looked at costing and then identifying a resource mobilization strategy and then launching it. We've come to realize that that's not sufficient, that in fact when we were looking at the policy framework, we needed to be looking at the finance policy framework particularly. I mean, when we're just looking at the agriculture policy framework, we need to bring this all back to finance. Recalling that what we're trying to do here is use finance as a lever for behavior change, for the mainstreaming agenda that we have. So seeing what is feasible and what is not. So we actually have evolved the program, and all of you have been engaged in that process, and over the next 2 days you'll be discussing that evolution. And there's been a lot of questions regarding some of the methodologies, and of course it's not easy because the costs, as I said, are dependent on the policy choices you make, and it's very complicated to work out sometimes what those policy choices should be, or whether indeed they're even feasible. Ultimately, we want to go to a world where we're implementing and bringing in resources to do the kind of things that the Philippines has done and other countries around here are testing, but to take it to scale. And ultimately, if we can be successful in mobilizing a portion of that $250 trillion worth of wealth for biodiversity, another kind of wealth, not financial wealth, but natural capital important to us as a sustenance, then we will have succeeded. So I want to end on that note. I think that it's been an enormous pleasure to work with the BIOFIN team, and I would like to thank Yves for his enormous leadership, the entire team, of course, for their hard work. Ono, you are the person behind the scenes greasing the wheel, and I'd like to thank you for organizing this meeting. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to participating in the deliberations. Thank you.